long before the humming of engines. Long before men split the atom. Before democracy had a name. Before the word science meant anything at all. There was a man. His name was Aristotle. He was not a king, nor a warrior, nor a saint. Yet he left an empire behind. Not of territory, but of ideas. Tonight, we travel back over 2 millennia, into a world of parchment, politics, and paradox. The life of a man whose thoughts shaped the minds of Caesar and Aquinas, of Darwin and Einstein. Settle in. Dim the lights. And join me on a journey through time. This is Echoes of the Past. And this is the life of Aristotle. It begins in the year 384 BC, in the small Macedonian town of Stagira, perched on the northeastern coast of Greece. A seaside town, windswept, fertile, and mostly unremarkable, save for what was born there. A child. A boy. Named Aristotle. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician. Not merely a healer, but a court doctor to King Amyntas III of Macedon, grandfather of the future Alexander the Great. This was no ordinary position. It meant Aristotle's early years were steeped in medicine, biology, observation, foundations that would grow into a scientific worldview generations ahead of its time. His mother, Phaestus, came from a family with ties to healing cults, possibly the Asclepiads, followers of Asclepius, the god of medicine. But the idyllic days of youth were cut short. Both of Aristotle's parents died when he was still a child. Orphaned, he was placed under the guardianship of a man named Proxenus, possibly an uncle. Little is recorded about these early years. But what is known, is that from a young age, Aristotle had a hunger. Not for power. Not for riches. But for understanding. He would spend hours observing animals, patterns in the sky, the structure of leaves. A boy drawn to the natural world as if by instinct. At the age of 17, this instinct pulled him toward the intellectual capital of the Greek world. A city unlike any other. Athens. The Athens of the 4th century BC was a living paradox. A cradle of democracy, yet filled with slaves. A city of philosophers, yet deeply superstitious. It had given the world Socrates, the gadfly of the state, who drank hemlock rather than abandon his principles. And it had given him a student, Plato. In a grove just outside the city walls, Plato had founded his school, the Academy, a place where minds could meet, challenge, and grow. And there, Aristotle arrived. 17. Foreign. Sharp-eyed. A Macedonian among Athenians. But he quickly distinguished himself, not just through knowledge, but through method. Whereas Plato explored the world through abstract ideals, Aristotle was rooted in the real. Plato taught that all we see is a shadow of some perfect form, an eternal ideal. But Aristotle wasn't content with shadows. He wanted to study the thing itself. A tree. A fish. A government. A friendship. He wanted to understand not just what should be, but what is. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle studied and taught at the Academy. He wrote. He debated. He questioned. Plato reportedly called him the mind of the Academy. But the two were not aligned forever. When Plato died in 347 BC, his nephew Speusippus was named head of the Academy. And Aristotle quietly left. The reasons are debated. Perhaps politics. Perhaps philosophy. But Aristotle's journey was not over. It was only changing course. After leaving Athens, Aristotle traveled across the Aegean to Assos, a city on the coast of Asia Minor. There, he joined a circle of philosophers gathered under Hermias, a former slave-turned-ruler of the region. In this small, fertile enclave, Aristotle found peace. And in the surrounding waters of the Aegean, he found inspiration. It was here that he conducted some of his most famous biological studies, dissecting sea creatures, categorizing animals, observing marine life with a precision that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. His notes on biology would become so detailed that in some cases, Modern scientists didn't surpass his observations until the 19th century. During these years, he married Pythias, the niece or daughter of Hermes. Their union was quiet, but enduring. They had one daughter, also named Pythias. But the peaceful days would not last. Hermes was captured and tortured by the Persians, accused of conspiring with Macedon. Aristotle, distraught, composed a hymn to virtue in his honor. And once more, he moved on. It was the year 343 BC. And Macedonia was stirring. A new king had taken the throne, Philip II, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, eager to transform Macedonia from a rugged kingdom into a dominant empire. At his side was a boy. Not yet a man. But already different. His name was Alexander. King Philip, a former student himself of Greek culture and military craft, wanted more than just strength for his son. He wanted brilliance. And so, he summoned the finest mind in the Greek world. Not a general. Not a poet. But a philosopher. Aristotle. Aristotle returned to Macedonia and was given a generous post. He was tasked with educating the young prince, and perhaps others in the royal circle. The boy was 13. Brilliant. Proud. Destined. Their lessons were not confined to books. They walked together. Talked for hours. Studied nature, history, medicine, and poetry. Aristotle introduced Alexander to Homer's Iliad, and is said to have edited a personal copy for him to carry on future campaigns. Whether Alexander adopted Aristotle's ethical views remains uncertain. But the prince who would one day conquer half the known world, first sat at the feet of a man who believed that knowledge, not power, was the greatest good. Aristotle's time in Macedonia lasted several years. But eventually, once the prince had grown and Philip's attentions turned to war, Aristotle again departed. This time, for Athens. In 335 BC, Aristotle returned to the city where he had once been a student. But now, he was the master. The academy, still operating under Plato's successors, was no longer his home. Instead, Aristotle founded a new school, just outside the walls of Athens, near a temple too. He called it the Lyceum. And here, among shaded walkways and long colonnades, Aristotle began the most productive period of his life. His students became known as peripatetics, from the Greek peripatein, meaning to walk about. For Aristotle was set to lecture while pacing. His method was different from Plato's dialectics. Instead of chasing ideals, Aristotle built systems. Observing. Categorizing. Defining. Every field of inquiry was welcome. Biology, astronomy, ethics, logic, politics, metaphysics. For Aristotle, philosophy was not a subject. It was a way of looking at the world. His Lyceum housed what was likely one of the first great libraries. Scrolls filled with his observations, notes, hypotheses, and teaching materials. Some say his assistants were tasked with traveling and collecting knowledge from distant lands. To gather facts. To build, piece by piece, a map of human understanding. His lectures were divided into two types. Morning lectures for his close disciples, deep, technical, often dense. Afternoon talks for the general public, engaging, persuasive, accessible. And through it all, he wrote dozens of works. Many now lost. But enough survived to echo through centuries. Before Aristotle, reasoning was an art. With Aristotle, it became a science. He did not invent logic, humans had reason long before him. But he was the first to formalize it. He gave logic structure, form, order, a shape that could be used again and again to test arguments, identify fallacies, and draw valid conclusions. What we now call the syllogism, a form of deductive reasoning, was his creation. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It seems simple. But in that simplicity lies a revolution. For Aristotle, logic was not just for debate, it was a tool of discovery, a scaffolding that could support all other branches of knowledge. He wrote extensively on logic in a collection known as the Organon, or instrument. Logic was the backbone. But the body it supported was vast. One of Aristotle's most ambitious quests was to understand being itself. Not just what things are, but what it means to be. This branch of philosophy, later called metaphysics, was so named not because Aristotle chose the word, but because his editors placed these books after the physics. In them, Aristotle explored substance, cause, and essence. He believed that every object has two aspects. A matter, what it is made of. A form, what gives it its shape, its purpose, its whatness. A statue is bronze, matter, but shaped into Athena, form. A tree is wood and fiber, but also treeness. This theory, called hylomorphism, argued that everything is a blend of matter and form, potential and actuality. And at the core of all things, he postulated a prime mover, a being that causes all motion but is itself unmoved. Not a god in the modern sense, but a perfect being, forever contemplating itself. And in doing so, pulling all creation toward its own perfection. He also wrote extensively on the soul, which he defined not as a ghostly presence, but as the form of a living body. Plants had souls. Animals too. But humans, he believed, possessed a rational soul, capable of thought, reflection, and virtue. In a world torn by extremes, tyranny and chaos, luxury and poverty, Aristotle searched for balance. And in ethics, he found it. For Aristotle, the purpose of human life was eudaimonia, a word often translated as happiness, but closer in meaning to flourishing, or living well. Eudaimonia is not a fleeting feeling. It is a life lived in accordance with virtue. But what is virtue? Not blind obedience. Not rigid rules. For Aristotle, virtue lay in the golden mean, the desirable middle between two extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and extravagance. Virtue was not one size fits all. It required judgment, deliberation, practice. We become brave, he said, by doing brave things. We become just, by doing just things. His Nicomachean Ethics, named after either his father or his son, remains one of the most influential texts in moral philosophy. And from ethics, Aristotle turned his gaze outward. To the polis. The city. The stage where human virtue played its greatest role. Aristotle saw humans as political animals. Not because we vote or govern, but because we live in communities. We form laws, traditions, shared aims. In his politics, he compared and analyzed real-world governments. Monarchies, aristocracies, tyrannies, democracies. He saw strengths and dangers in each. A monarchy could be just, or become a tyranny. An aristocracy could reward the wise, or descend into elitism. A democracy could empower the people, or slip into mob rule. The best government, he argued, was one that balanced interests. Where rule of law tempered ambition. Where education shaped citizens. The goal of the state, like the individual, was not conquest, but virtue. He even turned his attention to education, arguing that children must be raised with the state in mind, not merely as private individuals, but as future citizens. His ideas were not utopian. They were grounded. Practical. He believed in slavery, reflecting the norms of his time. And yet, he planted seeds of reform, of balance, of civic purpose. Seeds that would be picked up by later thinkers, from Cicero to Jefferson. When we think of science today, we think of telescopes and test tubes, hypotheses and experiments. But 2,000 years before the scientific method, there was Aristotle. He may not have had our tools, but he had something else. Observation. He watched animals with care. Dissected sea creatures on the island of Lesbos. Classified over 500 species, some of them with striking accuracy. He studied embryology by slicing open fertilized bird eggs, day by day, noting their development. He described the heart, the brain, the nervous system, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. He believed the brain cooled the blood, and that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. By modern standards, these were mistakes. But his approach, to look closely, to compare, to categorize, was revolutionary. He developed taxonomy before Linnaeus. Laid foundations for zoology, anatomy, and even psychology. His work in physics, though flawed, was deeply influential. He imagined a geocentric cosmos, Earth at the center, with celestial spheres surrounding it. This model would hold sway for nearly 2,000 years, until Copernicus and Galileo came to challenge it. But for Aristotle, science wasn't about control. It was about understanding the natural order, the why behind what we see. To him, every object had a purpose. A cause. A final end. A rock falls, because its nature is to seek the center. A tree grows, because it seeks to fulfill its form. This teleological view, seeing nature as striving toward goals, shaped Western thought for centuries. It was imperfect. But it was a beginning. Aristotle was a scientist, but also a lover of words. He saw language not as decoration, but as power, to move hearts, minds, and societies. In his work Rhetoric, he laid out the art of persuasion. He identified three appeals. A ethos, the speaker's credibility. A pathos, the emotional impact. A logos, the logic of the argument. These ideas became the backbone of communication theory, still taught in universities today. But perhaps even more striking was his work in literary theory, the Poetics. It is the earliest surviving work of its kind. A treatise on tragedy, and why humans tell stories the way we do. He examined plays not just as art, but as psychological instruments. Tragedy, he said, evokes pity and fear, and then purges them. This process he called catharsis. He studied structure, character, plot. Argued that the best tragedies focus on a noble figure brought low by a tragic flaw. His ideas shaped generations of playwrights, from Sophocles to Shakespeare. And his concept of drama as a mirror of human action laid the groundwork for modern storytelling. By 323 BC, the world was shifting. Alexander the Great, once Aristotle's pupil, was dead, struck down by illness at the height of his empire. In Athens, suspicion of Macedonian influence boiled over. Anti-Macedonian sentiment surged. And Aristotle, with his Macedonian ties, was suddenly vulnerable. He was accused of impiety, a familiar charge. One that had brought death to Socrates. Aristotle fled the city, saying he would not let Athens sin twice against philosophy. He withdrew to Chalcis, on the island of Euboea. There, among olive groves and sea air, he lived out his final days. In 322 BC, at the age of 62, Aristotle died. Likely of natural causes. Not in the forum. Not on the battlefield. But quietly. He left behind a son, Nicomachus, and a vast trove of writings, many still being compiled and edited by his students. He died in exile. But not in obscurity. Aristotle's body perished. But his mind, his words, his thoughts, did not fade. For centuries, his works were copied, debated, preserved. First by peripatetic scholars, then by Arab philosophers during the Islamic Golden Age. Translated into Arabic, then Latin. Reintroduced to Europe in the Middle Ages. Thinkers like Aquinas called him simply the philosopher. His ideas became central to Christian theology, Islamic metaphysics, and Jewish philosophy. He shaped the methods of scientific inquiry, the principles of ethics, the structure of logic and law. His authority was so towering that, for centuries, to argue against Aristotle was to risk heresy. And yet, it was only by challenging him, by questioning, testing, evolving, that science and philosophy moved forward. From Copernicus to Darwin, from Galileo to Nietzsche. Every thinker who rose in his shadow. Even today, we feel his presence. In every university. Every syllogism. Every debate about virtue or purpose. He taught us that the world can be known. That order exists in nature. That the human mind can uncover it. He built no temples. Commanded no armies. Yet his empire still stands. After Aristotle's death, his works drifted. Some were lost. Others scattered. His early dialogues vanished almost entirely. What survived were lecture notes, dense, unpolished, sometimes fragmented. For centuries, Western Europe forgot much of him. But far to the east, in the Islamic world, a light still burned. Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, cities where ancient knowledge was treasured. Scholars like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, read, preserved, and commented on Aristotle. They translated his works into Arabic. They debated his ideas. They merged his philosophy with Islamic thought. In a world where science and faith coexisted, Aristotle was their bridge. Then came the 12th century, a revival of learning in Christian Europe. Latin translations of Aristotle began pouring into universities, often through Arabic intermediaries. And suddenly, the West rediscovered its lost philosopher. Scholasticism was born, a movement to harmonize Aristotle with Christian doctrine. No one did more than Thomas Aquinas, who called him simply the philosopher. Aristotle's logic shaped theology. His ethics shaped morality. His metaphysics shaped cosmology. For medieval Europe, his words became a kind of second scripture. But time moves on, and empires of thought, like empires of stone, must one day be questioned. By the 16th and 17th centuries, cracks appeared. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in original Greek texts. Humanists began to separate Aristotle's insights from the dogma that had grown around them. And in the scientific revolution, new minds began to challenge Aristotle's physics. Copernicus placed the sun, not Earth, at the center. Galileo dropped objects from the Tower of Pisa, showing that mass doesn't affect falling speed. Newton gave us laws that contradicted Aristotle's motion theories. And yet, Aristotle still stood. Not as an infallible oracle, but as a foundation. His logic endured. His biology lingered. His ethics continued to stir debates. And in the Age of Enlightenment, he was rediscovered again, this time as a secular thinker. Kant wrestled with his ethics. Hegel saw him as a precursor. Darwin, though he overturned Aristotle's fixity of species, still admired his meticulous observations. His influence rippled into the modern world, not as gospel, but as grist for the mill of thought. What makes a thinker timeless? Is it correctness? Precision? No. It is the capacity to provoke thought across centuries. Aristotle was often wrong. He believed in spontaneous generation. He thought women were inferior by nature. He endorsed slavery as natural. We must not turn away from these failings. They are part of the man. A man of his time, and yet, ahead of it. For all his errors, he gave us tools. Tools for thinking, reasoning, questioning. He separated ethics from myth. Sought causes behind events. Studied the world as it is, not only as it ought to be. His Nicomachean ethics still asks us, what does it mean to live well? Not with wealth or fame, but with virtue, moderation, and reason. He challenged us to find the golden mean in our actions, to avoid both excess and deficiency. And in his logic, he forged the backbone of rational discourse, defining principles still used in law, science, and everyday debate. In this, Aristotle becomes not just a name in a textbook, but a mirror, reflecting back our desire to know, to explain, to understand. And so we return to the boy from Stagira, born to a doctor, raised in a kingdom, student of Plato, teacher of kings. And yet, more than any title or position, Aristotle was a seeker. He wandered the coasts of Lesbos with notebook in hand, taught in the shaded walkways of the Lyceum, argued with friends, debated with rivals, puzzled over the stars. His questions outlived his answers. And his voice, dry, meticulous, searching, still speaks. Across parchment. Across centuries. Across cultures and creeds. In every classroom where logic is taught. In every library where old scrolls gather dust. In every mind that asks, why? He is there. Not as a god. Not as a prophet. But as a man. A man who believed that the universe was not chaos, but order, waiting to be understood. And that the human mind was the instrument to do it. In this way, he changed the world. Not with sword or silver, but with thought. And long after his bones turned to dust, his ideas remained. Whispers in the halls of time. Echoes of the past. Not just what he thought, but how he thought. His method was empirical, based on observation, categorization, and careful reasoning. He didn't start with answers. He started with questions. What causes change? What is a living thing? What makes a life worth living? And he built from there, slowly, deliberately, like a craftsman shaping a sculpture. He gave names to patterns that others sensed but couldn't articulate. 4 causes: material, formal, efficient, final. The foundation of his natural philosophy. What is it made of? What is its form? Who or what made it? What is its purpose? He didn't just want to know that things were. He wanted to know why. In logic, he built syllogisms, basic arguments formed from premises and conclusions. If A is B, and B is C, then A is C. It sounds simple. But before Aristotle, no one had formally written this down. He created a system for rational thought. A toolkit for clarity. And in doing so, he became not just a philosopher, but the father of logic. We know his mind. But who was he? Biographers offer fragments. Pieces of personality glimpsed through ancient anecdotes. Some said he was sharp-tongued. Others, reserved. He had a slight lisp. His clothes were simple, his lifestyle, moderate. He was known to be generous with students. Precise with language. Patient in inquiry. He walked as he taught, through the shaded peripatos of the Lyceum. Hence, his students were called peripatetics, those who walk around. He once wrote that friendship was a mirror of the soul, that a true friend is another self. He believed in moderation, the middle path between excess and deficiency. Courage was not rashness. Generosity was not wastefulness. Pleasure was not hedonism. He sought the golden mean, in life, thought, and action. And though his views on women and slavery were deeply flawed, even by some contemporary standards, there is evidence that he wrestled with questions of justice and humanity more than many give him credit for. He was not perfect. He was not a prophet. He was a man, struggling to understand a world that, even then, resisted simple answers. The legacy of Aristotle is not linear. It twists. It branches. It doubles back. It has been used to justify monarchies, and to question them. It has guided religious doctrine, and inspired scientific rebellion. Karl Marx admired Aristotle's insights on labor. Nietzsche loathed his timidity and reasonableness. Einstein, when discussing space and time, still referred to Aristotle's cosmos, even to correct it. And today, in classrooms around the world, from logic courses in Tokyo to ethics seminars in Buenos Aires, his name appears, not just as history, but as a beginning of how we think, how we ask, how we doubt, and how we try, against all odds, to make sense of a universe that seems, at times, so beautifully incomprehensible. That's the real gift of Aristotle. Not that he gave us answers, but that he showed us how to live in the question. Look around you. The modern world hums with complexity: cars, smartphones, computers, satellites. It feels far removed from scrolls and sandals. But in quiet ways, Aristotle is still with us. In every formal debate, where logic is used to build an argument. In every courtroom, where cause and intention are weighed. In every ethics board, struggling with questions of AI or genetic engineering. His framework persists. Consider computer science. The branching logic of programming languages, if, then, echoes his syllogistic reasoning. Artificial intelligence itself, at least in its classical form, was built on logic trees not unlike those sketched in Aristotle's Organon. He laid down the idea that complex reasoning could be structured, analyzed, refined. And though he could never have imagined quantum computing or neural nets, his vision of a rational, ordered cosmos, where things could be understood through categories and causes, remains at the root of scientific inquiry. Even algorithms, at their core, are Aristotelian. Just, sped up a billion times. You may not hear his name in everyday life, but echoes of Aristotle appear in the most unexpected places. In superhero films, when characters wrestle with moral choices, not just good vs evil, but too much courage vs too little, you're watching the golden mean unfold. When screenwriters structure a three-act plot with a beginning, middle, and end, they are following rules from Aristotle's Poetics, the earliest surviving work of dramatic theory. He believed that a good tragedy purged the soul. That a well-structured story could teach us about ourselves. His influence can be found in Shakespeare, in Tolkien, in the films of Christopher Nolan, in the character arcs of Marvel's Iron Man or Breaking Bad's Walter White, men undone by flawed virtue, a classic Aristotelian idea. Even video games, with skill trees, progression systems, and ethical dilemmas, reflect his belief that habit builds character, and choice reveals the soul. Across genres and media, Aristotle lingers. Not as an Easter egg, but as architecture. He built the stage on which modern drama, narrative, and character still play. And now, as our journey nears its end, let us return to a single line. Perhaps the most famous line Aristotle ever wrote. Man is by nature a political animal. This phrase is often misunderstood. He didn't mean we're all obsessed with elections or campaigns. He meant we are social, rational, interconnected. That we cannot become fully human in isolation. We find meaning not in pleasure alone, but in engagement, in shaping the world together. To live well, Aristotle argued, is to live with purpose, with others, in a shared community of reason. That message, over 2,000 years old, might be more relevant now than ever. In an age of noise and speed, where opinions fly faster than understanding can follow, Aristotle invites us to slow down, to observe, to question, to discuss. He reminds us that wisdom is not just having knowledge, but knowing how to live it, how to balance thought and action, emotion and reason, self and society. And in the silence of that balance, we might just find something resembling truth. In the year 322 BC, Aristotle's long life neared its end. He had returned to Chalcis, on the island of Euboea, after fleeing Athens one final time. The city had turned on Macedonians following the death of Alexander the Great, and once again, the shadow of political vengeance loomed. Aristotle is said to have remarked that he left Athens to prevent the city from sinning twice against philosophy. A bitter reference to what it had done to Socrates. We don't know exactly how he died, perhaps from natural illness, possibly a stomach ailment. He was 62 years old. He was buried near his mother's grave. And that was the end of the man. But only the beginning of the echo. What is the weight of a life? Not the bones. Not the years. Not even the words. But the questions it leaves behind. Aristotle asked us to wonder. To question not only the stars and stones, but our own actions. To ask, what makes a life worth living? He taught us to build logic from thought. To draw ethics from experience. To seek truth, not in certainty, but in curiosity. His writings survived wars, empires, translations, and time itself. Carried in satchels by Islamic scholars through the Golden Age of Baghdad. Resurrected in Latin by monks in crumbling monasteries. Studied in Renaissance courts and Enlightenment salons. And now, whispered here, to you. Across continents. Across centuries. Echoes of a voice, still speaking. So tonight, as the world quiets. And sleep softens the mind. Let this remain. That a man once lived. In a time of myth and marble. Who sought not power. But understanding. And in doing so, left us something greater than monuments. He left us a way to think. Good night. This has been Echoes of the Past. I'm your narrator. And you are the future.